Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Uganda sees a second death from Ebola, but there is relief there, as no cases have been spread inside the country. The family of those who've died have been sent back to DR Congo, the origin of the world's second worst outbreak of the disease. We hear from our correspondent in Kampala. Also in Sudan, Omar al-Bashir has been charged with corruption. Meanwhile, the African Union and US envoys are leading mediation efforts between the military rulers and the protest movement in the wake of dozens of deaths by RSF forces. And cocoa prices on the global market rise sharply after the world's two largest cocoa-producing countries, Ghana and Ivory Coast, take joint action for the first time to force major buyers to agree to pay higher prices. But first, the WHO says that there is no evidence that an Ebola outbreak that's claimed 1,400 lives in DR Congo has spread within Uganda. There, communities got a scare after a little boy and his grandmother died of the disease this week. Their family had crossed over from DR Congo, and authorities say that they've sent the deceased's relatives back over the border, including an infected 3-year-old. Despite the swift response, Ugandans are worried that the virus could still spread.
It's a fearful situation. Even us ourselves, we started fearing ourselves. That's why even we have reached an extent of fearing your neighbor. I would advise most of the Congolese, if they are to cross to Uganda, they must come at least to the main post, so that they must be checked.
Me personally, I fear Ebola a lot, because it has finished us here at the border. We as moto taxi drivers are asking to receive help like protective gear, so that we can drive safely. We fear Ebola a lot. It has crossed from Congo to Uganda.
Now, it's Eastern DR Congo's second worst outbreak, the second worst outbreak in history as well, and it sparks concern throughout the region. Grania Harrington joins me now with more from Kampala. Grania, so no known case of Ebola has originated outside of DR Congo. Is that news? Has it done much to reassure communities in Uganda?
Well, yeah, I mean, so far that's still the case. But as we saw, the extent and the proximity of that outbreak in the DR Congo, just across the border, now the second biggest outbreak in history, is, of course, going to cause a lot of anxiety over this side of the border. It has been seen as almost inevitable that it was going to spread, but the Ugandan authorities have been really prepared. And so, as we saw in the outbreak in 2014, 2015, communication is really, really key around Ebola. And the Ugandan authorities have had a rapid and coordinated response to this right from the beginning, right from as soon as we heard that that case was confirmed after crossing the border from the DRC. So the health minister, Dr. Jane Cheng, traveled to the border area with officials from the Center for Disease Control and from the World Health Organization. They met with a district task force there. They made a plan. They asked for a budget to be able to immediately release emergency funds to try and contain any possible outbreak in the area. They also met with Congolese officials to better monitor that border at both official entry points and unofficial entry points. So there's been a lot of communication around it, and that budget is being prepared to be released. They've also sent extra vaccines to the area. And so that kind of communication will do a lot, hopefully, to reassure people around the border areas in Uganda.
Now, health workers say that the family of the two people who died in Uganda were sent back to DR Congo because they could get treatment there that's not yet ready in Uganda. So is there much of a difference between the countries in terms of preparedness to tackle the spread of the disease?
Well, absolutely, because the DRC, this was an unexpected outbreak, and while the DRC has handled Ebola quite well in the past, this is an area where there hasn't been an outbreak before in this part of the Congo, and it was possibly the worst possible case in that there is a lot of rebel violence in that area. So it is almost impossible to contain the outbreak in that kind of context where people are fleeing not only violence but the disease, and therefore tracing the contacts of people who've been in touch with patients is almost impossible. And that is really a key part of the Ebola response. In contrast, Uganda, the area where this case had crossed over, is a peaceful, secure, stable area. And so communication has been happening since the beginning of that outbreak in the DRC. Health workers are free to move around. They're already doing contact tracing for that family that crossed the border, and they are free to move around that area. So in contrast with the DRC, Uganda has been in preparedness mode since this outbreak in the DRC began, and they are now simply, it's a case of moving from that preparedness mode into a rapid response mode. So it's a very different context, and also, of course, in this kind of context in Uganda, the international community will be far more able to help since there is freedom of movement around that area, and it's a secure part of the country.
Thanks very much. Gonya Harrington there for us in Kampala. Well, as Gonya mentioned, part of the difficulty in tackling the Ebola outbreak is instability in eastern DR Congo. On Thursday, the governor of Ituri province said that at least 50 people were killed there over this week. Fighting around the town of Jugu has cost dozens of lives. It's not clear what caused the flare-up, but the local Lendu and Hema communities have a history of violent clashes. Sudan's ruling generals say that this weekend they will be releasing the results of an investigation into the deaths of protesters killed by security forces last week. They've admitted for the first time that they ordered the brutal crackdown on a sit-in in which protesters say about 100 people were killed last Monday. Some officers have reportedly been arrested in connection to the violence. Demonstrators have been trying to get generals who took over after the ousting of President Omar al-Bashir in April to hand over to civilian rule. The situation remains precarious.
2 months after he was toppled, Omar al-Bashir has been charged with corruption. In May, he had already been charged with involvement in the killing of protesters. Since his fall, the country has been ruled by his former military allies. They led a crackdown on protesters last week that left more than 100 people dead, according to opposition leaders. That prompted the African Union to suspend Sudan. Despite this, the AU's envoy is still holding talks with both the military council and the protesters.
I can say without excess optimism that the discussions that we are holding with each side separately are moving forward to a significant extent.
The protesters once again set out their conditions.
We reject direct negotiations with the military council. We do not think that negotiating with them directly will be of use. If we do negotiate, it will only be to reach an agreement to identify the procedures for the handover of power to a civilian government.
Washington has also sent an envoy to Sudan. Donald Booth is a veteran diplomat who worked in Sudan during Barack Obama's presidency. Both the US and the AU are pushing for civilian-led rule. But experts say that 3 regional Arab nations, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, on the other hand, appear to back the generals. Just days after Bashir's overthrow, Saudi Arabia and the UAE offered a $3 billion aid package to Khartoum.
Algeria's Supreme Court's taken former Prime Minister Abdel Malik Salal into custody. He's the second former PM to be arrested in 2 days to face corruption charges. Laura Berstecker has more.
Answering protesters' call to get rid of the old guard, Algeria's Supreme Court ordered the detention Thursday of former Prime Minister Abdel Malik Salal, a day after another former Prime Minister, Ahmed Ouyahia, was placed in custody, both over corruption allegations. The 2 men were close associates of long-serving President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was forced to step down in April following nationwide demonstrations and pressure from the army. Other high-profile figures have been detained in recent days, including former Transports Minister Abdelghani Zalan and Bouteflika's younger brother Said, as well as several prominent business leaders with ties to the former president. The wave of arrests could signal a willingness by Algeria's interim government to get rid of the country's ruling elite, which is perceived as corrupt by large swathes of the population. Yet with interim President Abdelkader Ben Salah and Prime Minister Noureddine Bedoui saying last week they would stay on until fresh elections are held, the latest crackdown is unlikely to fully satisfy protesters who continue to demand the complete departure of the old regime.
Well, female MPs in Kenya staged a mass walkout from Parliament on Thursday, chanting in protest against a male legislator who slapped a female colleague. Rashid Kassim's accused of assaulting Fatima Gedi because she didn't allocate money to his constituency. Gedi sits on the Budget Committee. Male colleagues allegedly began mocking women in Parliament after the incident, calling it slapping day. Kassim has since been arrested. Now, cocoa prices on the global market have risen sharply after the world's two largest cocoa-producing countries, Ghana and Ivory Coast, took joint action for the first time, forcing major buyers to agree to pay higher prices. Frank Hersey has more.
The price of cocoa leapt by 1.4% in just one day today following the outcome of a two-day meeting which finished yesterday in neighbouring Ghana. The trade councils for cocoa for both Ghana and Ivory Coast gathered the world's cocoa industry together to announce their attempt at setting a market price, ultimately to benefit their own cocoa farmers. They had initially threatened to halt future sales of cocoa, but as talks progressed, buyers agreed to a proposed minimum price of $2,600 per tonne. Cocoa crops are sold well in advance of being harvested, which means this new price won't come into effect until next year, but the news of it sent prices soaring today for this September's crop too. Cocoa hasn't been at $2,600 for over a year, and Ghana and Ivory Coast, which together produce over 60% of the world's cocoa, decided it was time to take joint action.
In the face of environmental and social challenges, our responsibility is also to address the issue of maintaining the interests of the producers in the cultivation of cocoa, to ensure that this activity is closely tied to a decent income for producers.
Cocoa is vital to the economy of both countries, but the commodity price has been so low that farmers around the world have been getting just a 6% slice of the $100 billion a year cocoa market. Here, that translates at around a third of the living wage. So the government has been subsidizing farmers, effectively subsidizing the likes of Nestle and Mondelez, and ultimately the chocolate-eating public. And so earlier in the year, the two countries came together to harmonize their pricing mechanism, giving them a cartel-like clout, and also reducing the cross-border smuggling between the two countries. And while we don't expect there to be any interruption to the supply of chocolate anytime soon, this action should mean a better standard of living in future for the farmers who make all that chocolate possible.
Well, that's it for Iron Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Reporters heads to Ghana, one of the world's largest electronic waste dumping grounds.
I'll go around and take some scrap in the floor to come and set it.
Yeah, it's burning place. We are burning waste.
This artificial island is taking over the lagoon. It's a toxic site that employs thousands of people every day.
A lot of dirty dumped to the plastic air, and the soil very much polluted. And you see the things they sell here, and people can't eat.
This open-air garbage pile is ruining Ghana's environment and spreading disease.
This used to be a national issue, and we thought that it is important to actually protect the health of our people.
Beyond condemning this environmental emergency, what steps has Europe taken? How can Europe encourage locals to work towards sustainable development?
Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.